The first time Margaret Garrison saw Stephen Keene, he was sitting alone at the far end of the bar in Dusty Creek's only saloon, nursing a whiskey he hadn't touched in 20 minutes, staring at nothing like a man who had made a private agreement with emptiness and was determined to honor it. It was the autumn of 1878, and the town of Dusty Creek, nestled in the high desert of New Mexico territory, was the kind of place that collected broken things the way arroyos collected rainwater briefly, urgently, and with a tendency to overflow without warning. The land itself was dramatic and unforgiving, all red clay and sage and sky so wide it made a person feel both enormous and invisible at the same time. The mountains rose in the north like the spines of sleeping giants, and the wind came down from them each evening carrying the smell of pine and something older than memory. Margaret had arrived on the stage 3 days prior, hired on as the new schoolteacher for the settlement's modest one-room schoolhouse. She was 26 years old, with dark hair that she wore pinned practically beneath a sensible hat, and eyes the color of creek water in October, not quite green, not quite gray, but something shifting and attentive between the two. She was not a woman who made a great deal of noise when she entered a room, but people noticed her all the same, in the way you notice a lamp lit in a window when you've been walking in the dark for a long time. She had come to Dusty Creek from Santa Fe, where she had taught at the territorial school for 2 years before the school board there had quietly replaced her with the son-in-law of one of the board members. The West was full of small injustices like that, administered without ceremony, without apology, and with the confident assumption that women like Margaret would simply absorb the blow and move along. She had moved along. But she had not absorbed it without feeling it, and it had left in her a particular kind of clarity about the way the world treated people it considered inconvenient. She had not intended to go into the saloon that evening. She had gone in because the apothecary next door was already closed, and she needed camphor for a student who had come to school that morning with a rattling cough that worried her. The barkeep, a wide man named Hector Prout with a sympathetic face and a habit of keeping half a pharmacy behind his counter for emergencies, told her he had some in the back and went to fetch it. That was when she noticed Stephen Keene. He was perhaps 30, or close to it. It was hard to say precisely because his face carried the kind of weathering that the territory put on a man regardless of his actual years. He was tall, even-seated, with broad shoulders that curved inward just slightly, as though he'd spent a long time trying to take up less space than he actually occupied. His hat was pulled low, his jaw was rough with several days' worth of dark beard, and his hands around the whiskey glass were large and scarred in the way of a man who worked with them constantly. He wore a deputy's badge on his vest, though he wore it the way a man wears something he's forgotten is still there. What caught Margaret's attention was not any of that precisely. It was the quality of his stillness. Most men in saloons were animated by the place, by the cards and the conversation and the noise. This man was surrounded by all of it and utterly separate from it, like a stone in the middle of a stream. And around that stillness, if you looked carefully, and Margaret was constitutionally incapable of not looking carefully, there was a kind of ache, not dramatic ache. Not the performed suffering of a man looking to be noticed. Just the quiet, persistent ache of someone who had been alone for a very long time and had simply stopped expecting it to be otherwise. She recognized it because she had felt something close to it herself. Hector came back with the camphor and wrapped it in brown paper for her, and she paid him and said good night. She was almost to the door when she stopped. She turned back, not because she had planned to, but because something in her, that same directness that had made her both effective and inconvenient throughout her life, would not let her walk past a thing she had clearly seen without acknowledging it. She crossed the room and set her parcel on the bar beside the man's glass. "You haven't drunk that," she said, nodding at the whiskey. He looked up at her slowly, and his eyes were dark brown, almost black in the lamplight, and they held in them exactly the quality she had seen from across the room, guarded and quiet and deeply, thoroughly tired. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "No, ma'am, I have not. May I ask why you ordered it?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite amusement, but in the same family. "Habit, I suppose. Habit of ordering it or habit of not drinking it." He studied her for a moment with the careful attention of a man deciding whether a thing is safe. "Both, maybe," he said finally. She nodded as though this made perfect sense, which to her it did. "I'm Margaret Garrison," she said. "The new schoolteacher." "I know who you are," he said. "Word travels fast here." He paused and then added with the slight stiffness of a man unused to social exchange, "Stephen Keene, deputy sheriff." "I know who you are too," she said, and she smiled, and he looked at her like a man who has forgotten that smiles are a thing that exist in the world and has just been reminded. "Good evening, Deputy Keene." She picked up her parcel and walked out, and the night air hit her face, cool and scented with sage, and she thought about the look in his eyes for longer than was probably sensible. She thought about it for several days, in fact. She learned about Stephen Keene the way you learn things in small western towns, in fragments from different people, assembled slowly into something approaching a whole. Hector at the saloon mentioned, while she was buying liniment for one of her older students who had twisted an ankle, that Keene had been a deputy going on 4 years, that he was good at his job in the way of a man who does a thing, because it keeps him from having to think about other things. The woman at the dry goods store, Ruth Calloway, told her while weighing out dried beans that Keene had been married once, about 3 years back, and that his wife Clara had died of fever before their first anniversary. Ruth said it the way people say things they have said many times, with the smoothed edges of repeated telling, but her eyes were sympathetic. Margaret filed all of it away. She did not ask questions. She simply listened, and what she heard confirmed what she had seen in the saloon. That Stephen Keene was a man who had built himself a life entirely out of function, out of duty, out of putting one boot in front of the other, because the alternative, which was to stop moving and feel everything, was something he could not allow himself. She saw him in passing several times that first week. He tipped his hat to her in the street with a grave courtesy that she suspected he extended to most women as a matter of principle, rather than particular attention. He held a door for her at the post office. Once, when her students spilled out of the schoolhouse at lunch recess and flooded the main street with their noise and energy, she caught him watching from across the road with an expression that lasted only a moment before he shuddered at something yearning and careful and immediately disciplined away. She pretended not to see it, but she did see it. She always saw it. The occasion that changed things between them arrived on a Tuesday in the middle of October, when a late-season storm rolled down from the mountains with very little warning and deposited 6 inches of mud on the only road out of town, stranding the stage and several travelers, and also, as it happened, depositing a crisis directly on the schoolhouse doorstep. One of her students, a boy named Thomas Alvarado, 8 years old and quick as a whip, had not gone home after school. His mother came in a panic to the schoolhouse near sundown, and Margaret, who had stayed late marking papers, went immediately with her to search. Within an hour it was clear that this was beyond a matter of a boy playing too long at the creek. Stephen Keene organized the search with the quiet efficiency that apparently characterized everything he did, dividing the available men into groups and assigning them sectors of the surrounding land. Margaret went with the group searching the old mining claim to the north of town, because she knew the land better than she had any right to after only 2 weeks. She had spent her weekends walking, and she spotted the boy wedged under an overhang of red rock half a mile from the road, shivering and frightened but uninjured, having followed a rabbit into the scrub and gotten disoriented when the storm hit. She got him out, wrapped him in the blanket she had thought to bring, and carried him back to the road. Stephen Keene met her there with a lantern, and when he saw her emerge from the dark with the boy bundled against her shoulder, something happened in his face that he could not quite manage to hide in time. It was relief, yes, and the particular alertness of a man whose job involves regular near misses with catastrophe. But it was also something softer than that, something she did not name yet. "You found him," he said. "He found a rabbit first," she said. "The rabbit won temporarily." Thomas Alvarado chose this moment to sneeze on her shoulder with impressive force, and Stephen Keene almost smiled. It was the closest she had seen him come to it. Transformed his face in ways that were startling and somehow unfair. "You should have stayed in town," he said, falling into step beside her as she carried the boy back toward the lights. "I know the land," she said simply. "It would have been wasteful not to help." He glanced at her sideways. "Most women who arrive on the stage don't go walking the scrub on their weekends. Most people don't look at things carefully enough to know what they're walking through," she said. "I find it useful to look at things carefully." He was quiet for a moment. "I've noticed that about you," he said, and then, as though he'd said more than he intended, he looked away. Thomas Alvarado was reunited with his mother with a great deal of weeping and embracing, and the boys embarrassed squirming, and the gathered townspeople dispersed, and Stephen walked Margaret back to her boarding house through the mud and the lantern-lit dark without either of them planning for him to do so. At her door she turned to thank him, and found him looking at her with that same careful attention he had given her in the saloon, measuring something, or deciding something, or both. "You're not what I expected," he said. "It wasn't quite a compliment and it wasn't quite not one." "What did you expect?" she asked. He thought about it. "Someone less comfortable out in the dark," he said finally. "The dark doesn't bother me much," she said. "It's the spaces between people that I find harder to navigate." He looked at her for a long moment after that, and she thought for just a second that he was going to say something real, something from wherever the true Stephen Keene lived beneath the badge and the habit and the untouched whiskey. But he only said good night, and tipped his hat, and walked back into the mud and the dark, and she watched him go with the feeling of standing at the edge of something she could not yet see the shape of. November arrived, and with it the particular beauty of the high desert in autumn, the light lower and more golden, the sage sending up its sharp perfume in the cold mornings, the mountains to the north wearing their first real snow like a promise of harder things to come. Margaret had settled into the rhythms of Dusty Creek by then, had learned her students' names and their quirks and the particular circumstances of each of their families, and had begun to feel the cautious, provisional warmth of a place deciding whether to accept you. She and Stephen Keene moved around each other the way people do when something has begun without either of them officially beginning it. He developed a habit of walking past the schoolhouse each morning on his rounds. It was not, strictly speaking, on his usual route, but no one pointed this out. She developed a habit of having her morning coffee on the schoolhouse step on clear days, and they would exchange a few words, careful and precise as currency, about the weather or the town or something one of her students had done. He was not a voluble man. Most mornings he said very little, and she had learned not to fill his silences with chatter, the way she might have done with someone else. She let them sit between them, and found that they were not uncomfortable silences but a different kind of communication, the kind that says I am here and I find your presence bearable and perhaps something more than that, but I am not yet ready to say the more than that part aloud. She was patient. She was, by nature and by experience, a patient woman. The incident with the Calloway brothers changed things again. Walt and Dermot Calloway, no relation to Ruth at the dry goods store, and quick to point that out, rode into town on a Wednesday afternoon in early November with the particular aggressive energy of men who had been drinking since before noon and were looking for the world to give them trouble so they could feel justified in giving it back. They weren't dangerous men exactly, but they were the kind of careless that could become dangerous, and they had decided, for reasons that were never entirely clear, to take issue with the school, and with the fact that it was teaching Mexican children alongside white children, which some of the more unpleasant elements of Dusty Creek had been grumbling about since Margaret arrived. She was in the middle of a reading lesson when they stopped their horses outside the schoolhouse window and began making their feelings known with the eloquence of men who have never had to be eloquent because they've always had volume on their side. Margaret was a schoolteacher. She had spent 2 years in Santa Fe dealing with a school board that didn't want her there, and she had dealt with it by being so thoroughly competent that they couldn't justify dismissing her until they found a pretense. She knew the architecture of this kind of ugliness, the way it depended on the target shrinking, apologizing, making itself small. She did not shrink. She stepped outside and she said to Walt and Dermot Calloway, in a voice that had silenced 30 children simultaneously and could apparently carry across a desert morning with remarkable clarity, that they would remove themselves from the vicinity of her school immediately, or she would ensure that the school board, the county sheriff, and every letter-writing relative she possessed in Santa Fe and beyond heard about this particular moment in detail. She said it without raising her voice. She said it the way you say a thing when you are absolutely certain of it. Walt Calloway stared at her for a long moment. Then Stephen Keene materialized at the corner of the building, having apparently been close enough to observe developments, and leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and his badge catching the light and his eyes on Walt with an expression of total stillness that was somehow more threatening than movement would have been. "You heard the teacher," Stephen said. The Calloway brothers rode away. It was really that simple in the end, though the preceding minute had been extremely tense. Later, when the children were at their noon recess, Stephen came to the schoolhouse door. She was at the blackboard, writing the next lesson's spelling words, and she heard his step on the threshold and said without turning, "Come in, please," because she recognized already the particular weight of his footfall. He came in, hat in hand, and stood in the middle of the room among the small desks as though uncertain of the geography. He looked around at the children's drawings pinned to the walls, at the map of the territories, at the globe she had brought from Santa Fe at considerable personal expense. "They won't trouble you again," he said. "I know," she said. "I told them not to." "I know you did," he said. "I heard." He paused. "Most people would have sent for me first." She turned then and looked at him. "Would you have gotten there faster if I had?" He considered this. "No," he admitted. Then there was no advantage to waiting. She tilted her head. "You're going to tell me it wasn't safe." "It wasn't safe," he said. "I know," she said. "But they were in front of my school, frightening my students. There are some things where the risk calculus is not complicated." He looked at her for a long moment with that expression she was coming to know, the one where something was happening in him that he didn't quite know how to manage. "You're a remarkable woman, Miss Garrison," he said, and it came out with a kind of rough honesty, like something he'd said before he thought to stop it. "Margaret," she said, "we've found a boy in the dark together, deputy. I think we've earned first names." Something in him relaxed by a degree that would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. "Margaret," he said. And the way he said it, quiet and careful and somehow meaningful, as though he was holding something fragile, made her heart do a thing she was not entirely prepared for. "Stephen," she said, returning it. He left shortly after, but at the door he turned back. "There's a box supper at the church Friday evening," he said, in the tone of a man reading from a prepared statement. "The women bring supper boxes and they're auctioned to raise money for the roof. I wondered," he stopped, started again. "I wondered if you might be bringing a box." "I might be," she said carefully. "I wondered if you might tell me which one yours is." She looked at him steadily, keeping her expression neutral though it required some effort. "The one with the blue ribbon," she said. "And Stephen, try not to let anyone outbid you too badly. I'm told my apple cake is not without merit." He left, and she turned back to her spelling words, and she was smiling so hard at the blackboard that she was extremely grateful none of her students were in the room to see it. The box supper was a Dusty Creek institution, one of those social rituals that the frontier had developed out of necessity, and then layered with ceremony and meaning until they became something a community actually needed. The church was lit with lanterns. The women's boxes lined up in their decorated splendor along the front table, and half the town crowded in with their auction paddles and their opinions about who ought to be bidding on what. Stephen Keene came in late, which she suspected was deliberate, less time for conversation before the auction, less time to accidentally reveal the specific intention he had already told her about. He nodded to her from across the room with the grave politeness he used in public, and she nodded back, and she watched his eyes find the box with the blue ribbon and rest there with the focused attention of a man locating a landmark. The bidding, when it came to her box, went sideways in a way neither of them had anticipated. A man named Gerald Fitch newly arrived in town, apparently with money from cattle operations to the east, and apparently also with the assumption that money in the territory solved most social obstacles, bid aggressively and cheerfully against Stephen for several rounds, either unaware of or indifferent to the specific quality of Stephen's expression, which had moved from composed to carefully controlled to something that Margaret, watching, could only describe as a man deciding not to do something he wanted to do. She watched Stephen raise his paddle one more time, and Gerald Fitch raise his immediately, and she watched Stephen's jaw set, and she thought, he is going to stop bidding because he doesn't want to make a scene. And she thought, this is the moment where being too proud or too careful or too practiced at retreat will rob him of something he actually wants. And she thought, with the clarity that had always characterized her thinking in moments that mattered, I am not going to let that happen. She caught Stephen's eye from across the room and gave him the smallest, most composed nod she possessed. It said, go on. It said, this one is worth it. It said, to a man who knew how to read things carefully even if he had trouble saying them, I want you to win this. He raised his paddle. Gerald Fitch raised his. Stephen held his paddle up and turned his gaze on Gerald Fitch with an expression so quiet and so absolutely clear that the room, which had been buzzing with the pleasure of a good auction fight, went oddly silent. Gerald Fitch lowered his paddle. The auctioneer said, sold, and the room laughed and applauded, and Margaret walked to claim her box with her heart doing the same undignified thing it had been doing since she said his name to him in the schoolroom. And they sat together at a table near the window with her apple cake between them and really talked, with none of the careful measuring of before, for the first time. He told her about growing up in Kansas, in a family of 5 boys and a father who ranched, and a mother who was sharp-tongued and warm-hearted in equal measure. He told her about coming to New Mexico territory 6 years ago, chasing work after a bad drought. He told her, not directly but in the way of a man who cannot quite leave something alone even when he means to, about Clara, about how she had been bright and brave, and how the fever had taken her in a week, how he had felt afterward like someone had reached into him and removed something structural, some load-bearing thing, and left him still standing but different in ways that didn't show on the outside. He didn't say any of this with self-pity. He said it with the even, careful voice of a man reporting facts, but she heard everything underneath the facts, and she let him say all of it without rushing him, and when he was quiet she said, I'm sorry. That kind of loss is the hardest kind. The kind that doesn't leave a mark anyone else can see. He looked at her. That's exactly what it's like, he said. I haven't heard anyone say it that way before. Most people try to make grief manageable by giving it a shape they recognize, she said. Loss that doesn't fit the shape makes people uncomfortable. You've had losses like that, he asked. My mother died when I was 19, she said. And my teaching position in Santa Fe was taken from me by a school board who considered my competence less important than nepotism. Those are not equivalent losses, but they share the quality of not quite fitting the approved grief narrative. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the board in Santa Fe were fools. Yes, she agreed, but their foolishness brought me here. She looked at him steadily. So I have complicated feelings about it. He looked back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, open, almost startled, as though something he had been bracing for had not arrived, and he was adjusting to the absence of it. He looked younger, suddenly, less like a man at duty and more like a man. They finished the apple cake and sat talking until the church began to empty around them, and then he walked her home through the November cold with the stars enormous overhead and the town quiet around them, and at her door he stopped and said her name, Margaret, as though he was trying it out again, making sure it still fit the way he'd said it. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "Not the auction, just talking to you." "I would like that too," she said. He nodded and touched the brim of his hat, and she watched him walk away, and she thought, "There it is. There is the shape of the thing I have been watching take form since that first night in the saloon." December came to Dusty Creek with a ferocity that surprised even the people who had lived there for years. The snows from the north came early and heavy, and the mountains disappeared behind cloud for days at a time, and the cold was the dry, penetrating kind of the high desert that finds every gap in your coat and makes itself at home. The town pulled inward, the way small western towns do in winter. Fires banked higher, conversations moved inside, distances that had been a 10-minute walk became events requiring preparation. Stephen began to find reasons to stop by the schoolhouse that were not entirely related to the security of the premises. He brought her a load of firewood one morning because he had noticed, with the attention he apparently directed at her without meaning to, that she had been accepting the small logs that Hector Prout provided, and those were not adequate for the stove. He appeared one afternoon with the news that a section of the schoolhouse roof had a weak point that he and the Alvarez brothers, whose son Thomas was in her class, would like to repair on Saturday if she had no objection. She had no objection. She made them coffee and food while they worked, and she listened to them on the roof above her, the sound of hammers in Spanish and Stephen's occasional low response to something, and she felt something in her chest that was specific and warm and that she recognized, finally, without any more pretending otherwise, as love. Not the first flush of it. She had felt that in stages, the saloon and the dark search and the schoolroom and the box supper, but the settled, bone-deep version of it, the kind that knows itself. The question, of course, was what to do with it in a man who did not yet know how to ask for what he needed. She thought about this carefully. She was not a woman who pushed. But she was also not a woman who waited passively for circumstances to resolve themselves when she could, with a small and precise intervention, assist the resolution. That Saturday evening, after the roof was repaired and the Alvarez brothers had gone home, Stephen stayed. She had made supper nothing elaborate, beans and cornbread, and the last of the dried apple pie filling in a pastry she had made from memory of her mother's recipe, and she set it on the table and said, "Stay and eat, please. You've done a great deal of work and I would like the company." He stayed. They ate and they talked, and after supper he helped her wash the dishes with the practical matter-of-factness of a man who was raised in a large family where everyone pulled their weight, and the domestic intimacy of it, standing side by side at the wash basin, handing things back and forth, was so comfortable that they were both quiet for a while, and the quiet was the warmest thing she had felt in a very long time. Then he said, drying the last plate, not looking at her, "I think about you more than is probably appropriate, given that I haven't been honest about it." She took the plate from him and put it on the shelf. "What would being honest about it look like?" she asked. He set down the dishcloth and turned to face her, and he looked like a man standing at the edge of something with no map and no certainty of the landing, and he said, "It would look like me telling you that I have not felt anything like what I feel around you in a very long time, and that it frightens me some, because the last time I let myself—" He stopped. "Because the last time you lost it," she said gently. He met her eyes. "Yes." "Stephen," she said, and she said it the way she had in the schoolroom, but warmer now, with less carefulness and more of the truth underneath it. "I understand that you are afraid. Loss of that kind changes the arithmetic of risk. It makes the calculation look impossible." She paused. "But I am not going anywhere. I am not Clara, and I am not a fever, and what I feel for you, which I will be honest about since one of us should be, is real and considered and not something I arrived at lightly." He was very still. You feel it too, he said, not quite a question. I have felt it since the saloon, she said, that first night. He exhaled slowly, like a man setting down a weight he has carried so long he had forgotten what the absence of it felt like. I don't know how to do this, he said. I'm out of practice in ways that probably make me a frustrating prospect. You are not frustrating, she said. You are careful, there is a difference. She looked at him steadily. I am patient and I am not asking you for anything tonight except honesty. You've given me that. He looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand carefully, the way you handle something you know the value of, and he held it, and she felt the warmth of his palm against hers and thought, yes, this is right, this is exactly right. I would like to court you properly, he said, if you'll permit it. I will permit it, she said. I would in fact welcome it. Something in his face, the last of the armor, the final held-back piece of him, came loose, and he smiled. A real smile, full and unhurried, and it did the same thing to his face it had done before, but more so, and she thought she would probably never entirely recover from it. The courtship of Stephen Keene and Margaret Garrison was not a thing that Dusty Creek was able to ignore, which was fine because neither of them particularly tried to hide it. Small towns have opinions about these things, and Dusty Creek's opinion was, on the whole, warm. Hector Pruitt at the saloon said to anyone who asked that it was about time. Ruth Calloway at the dry goods store said that Stephen had needed someone since before anyone cared to count, and that Margaret Garrison was clearly a woman of sense and mettle. Thomas Alvarado's mother said something in Spanish to her husband that made him laugh and nod, and Stephen, hearing a fragment of it from across the street, turned slightly red under his permanent tan. They took Sunday rides when the weather permitted, Stephen on his roan horse, and Margaret on the bay mare that the livery rented to her, out into the high desert where the land opened up, and the sky did that thing it did in New Mexico of becoming so much bigger than you expected. They talked endlessly on those rides, about books and history and the state of the territory and the injustice of the Indian Wars, which Margaret held fierce opinions about, having spent time in Santa Fe, where the human cost of federal policy was visible in ways that were hard to look away from. Stephen listened to her opinions with the focused attention he gave everything, and he disagreed with her sometimes, and their disagreements were the good kind, the kind where both parties are actually thinking and neither is performing. He told her things on those rides that she suspected he had not told anyone in years, about his father's ranch in Kansas and the specific smell of it in summer. About the war, he had been too young to fight, but old enough to watch his older brothers go and one of them not come back, and he talked about that brother, whose name was James, with the careful love of someone who has carried a grief for a long time and found ways to wear it that fit. About Clara, not in the way of a man still unable to release it, but in the way of a man who has finally, in the presence of someone who can hold it without flinching, been able to set it down properly and look at it. She told him about her own life with equal honesty, about her mother's death and the way it had hollowed out her father, a kind man who had simply not known how to exist without his wife, and had retreated into work and distance in ways that left young Margaret largely to her own considerable resources. About her years at the normal school in Missouri, where she had excelled and been told, in various gentle and not-so-gentle ways, that she was too direct and too confident and ought to moderate herself for the comfort of others. About Santa Fe and the school board and the particular sting of competence being rewarded with dismissal because someone more convenient came along. Do you regret coming here? He asked her once on a Sunday in late December when they had stopped on a ridge that looked out over the valley, the town a scatter of pale buildings far below in the winter light. Not for a single moment, she said. She looked at him. I haven't had anything to regret about my life in Dusty Creek until you arrived, he said, and now I'm regretting the 4 years before you. It was the most romantic thing she had heard in her life, and she told him so, and he turned that particular color again and said he hadn't meant it to be romantic, just factual. And she said those were not mutually exclusive. And he kissed her for the first time right there on the ridge with the winter valley spread out below them and the cold in the air, and the horses stamping their feet patiently. It was a very good kiss. Careful and then not careful at all, which she thought was probably the most honest summary of Stephen Keene that one could produce. January in the territory was hard living, and the schoolhouse had to close for 2 weeks in the first part of the month when a blizzard came through that made travel impossible and left Dusty Creek sealed in its own white silence. Margaret spent those days with her books and her papers and occasional, warming visits from Stephen, who was spending his time helping dig out the older residents and checking on anyone who might be in difficulty. He came to her boarding house one evening during the blizzard with snow on his coat, and his face wind-burned, and said that old Joe Carmichael at the north end of town had been found in reasonable shape, but that his woodpile was nearly gone, and that he had arranged for more to be brought in the morning. He said it with the matter-of-factness of a man for whom looking after others was as natural as breathing, and she looked at him across Mrs. Harper's warm parlor and thought, "This man has been taking care of everyone in this town for years, and no one has been taking care of him." She made him sit down. She made him tea, real tea, which she had sent for from Santa Fe and hoarded carefully. She brought a towel for his hair, which was damp with melted snow, and she sat across from him and said, "Tell me something good that happened today." He looked at her blankly, as though the question was in a language he recognized but did not quite speak. "Something good?" "Yes," she said. "Something that wasn't about a problem or a duty or someone who needed help. Something you saw or heard or thought that was simply good." He was quiet for a moment. "The Alvarez children were building something in the snow this morning when I went past," he said slowly. "Some kind of animal. I couldn't tell what it was supposed to be. It had 7 legs. "Was it good?" she asked. "It was very good," he said, and he looked at her with an expression of such unguarded warmth that she felt it all the way through, and she thought, "This is what he looks like when no one is watching and he forgets to put the walls back up. This is the real one. You should have more moments like that," she said quietly. "Not only the hard ones." He set down his tea and looked at her seriously. "I have more of them than I used to," he said, "since you came." She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and they sat like that in Mrs. Harper's parlor with the blizzard outside and the fire inside, and it was as close to perfect as she had ever been. The spring came in March with the dramatic suddenness the territory specialized in 1 week of snow, and then warmth and bloom and the smell of wet earth, the arroyos running full, the desert going briefly and brilliantly green. With the spring came several things at once, some of them welcome and some of them not. The first thing was a letter from Santa Fe addressed to Margaret, from the Territorial School Board, informing her that they were reorganizing and that the position in Dusty Creek was being reclassified, and that they would need a formal reapplication from all current teachers. It was, as she read it, the same mechanism that had been used against her before. The reclassification that was not really a reclassification, the formal process that was not really formal, but a way of creating an opening through which someone more convenient could pass. She sat with the letter for an afternoon before she told Stephen about it, which she did that evening over supper at the restaurant that Hector Pruitt's wife Rosa ran out of the back of the saloon, an arrangement that was somewhat irregular but produced remarkably good food. He read the letter twice. His expression was very still in the way that, she now knew, indicated strong feeling rather than the absence of it. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to fight it if fighting is possible." "It's possible," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. "The town council here has authority over local appointments. They can advocate to the territorial board. The school board in Santa Fe doesn't have absolute power over a local municipality that's willing to push back. Do you know that for a fact?" "I spent yesterday morning reading the territorial education ordinances at the sheriff's office," he said. She stared at him. "You spent yesterday morning. "I saw the envelope on your table when I came to pick you up for our ride," he said, with the composed expression of a man who has done a thing and considers it self-explanatory. "You didn't open it immediately, which told me it was something you were concerned about. I thought it would be useful to know the relevant law before you told me what it was." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from the deepest warmth, from a feeling of being genuinely, specifically known. "Stephen Keene," she said. "What?" he said, and he was not quite managing to hide that he was pleased. "You are a remarkable man," she said, returning it to him in the exact words he had given her months ago. "I have learned from a remarkable woman," he said. And then he laid out, in clear and organized terms, what he thought could be done about the letter, and what he had already done, which included, apparently, a quiet conversation that morning with Mayor Patterson, who thought highly of Margaret and had 2 children in her class, and was not inclined to let the territorial board push the town of Dusty Creek around on the matter. The fight with the territorial school board took most of March and required letters written to every relevant authority Margaret or Stephen could identify, and a formal petition signed by nearly every family in Dusty Creek whose children attended the school, and a very direct letter from Mayor Patterson that apparently contained some forceful language about the autonomy of local municipal bodies. In the end, the reclassification was withdrawn and Margaret's position was confirmed, and she received the news on a bright April morning and immediately went to find Stephen, who was at the sheriff's office doing paperwork, and she walked in without knocking and told him, and he stood up from his desk, and she saw something in his face that she would remember for a very long time, a complex mixture of relief and joy, and something that looked almost like the last barrier going down. "Good," he said. And then, without any particular preamble or apparent planning, "Will you marry me?" She looked at him. "Did you just propose to me in the sheriff's office while you were doing paperwork?" He looked around as though just noticing his surroundings. "Yes," he said, "I appear to have done that." He came around the desk. "I had planned something more considered, but then you came in and told me the news and I couldn't wait any longer to ask." He took her hands in both of his. "I have loved you since that ridge in December," he said. "I have probably loved you since the saloon if I am being fully honest, which you have taught me to be." He looked at her steadily, without walls, without the careful management of expression she had seen when they met. "I know I'm not always easy. I know I'm quiet, and sometimes I'm in my own head in ways that must be frustrating. But I want to spend my life with you, Margaret. I want to be the person who takes care of you the way you've taken care of everyone around you without ever asking for anything in return." Her eyes were not entirely dry. She blinked once precisely. "Yes," she said. "Stephen Keene, the answer is absolutely yes." He kissed her in the sheriff's office with the paperwork on the desk and the morning light through the window, and she thought, "I have been looking carefully at things my whole life, and this is the best thing I have ever seen." They were married in June, in the church whose roof Stephen had helped repair the previous November, in a ceremony that the entire town of Dusty Creek attended, and that Rosa Prout catered with a spread of food that people talked about for months afterward. Thomas Alvarado, who had been found under that red rock overhang in October and had appointed himself their unofficial mascot since then, served as some sort of junior usher and took his responsibilities with tremendous seriousness, directing guests to their seats with the authority of a small general. Margaret wore her mother's brooch on the shoulder of her best dress, and Stephen wore his suit with the badge removed for the occasion because Margaret had asked him to, and he had understood immediately why. Today was not the deputy. Today was just the man. He had cut his hair and shaved, and he looked clean-edged and almost startlingly handsome, and when she walked toward him through the church he looked at her with that open, unhurried look she had seen first in Mrs. Harper's parlor during the blizzard, and she felt it through every layer. The minister said the words, and they said theirs in return, and when the minister said he could kiss his bride, Stephen took her face in both his hands with that same careful reverence she had felt since the first time he took her hand, and kissed her while the church applauded, and Thomas Alvarado cheered with startling volume, and Rosa Prout wept happily in the front row. The summer of 1879 settled over Dusty Creek like a warm hand. Margaret continued teaching school, let out in July and resumed in September, and she spent the summer months writing a proposal for expanding the school's curriculum that she sent to the new territorial superintendent, who was, blessedly, a man of genuine educational conviction who responded with interest. Stephen continued his work as deputy with the steady, competent dedication that had always characterized it, but there was something different in him now, a quality of presence, of being actually in his life rather than adjacent to it, that the people of Dusty Creek noticed without necessarily being able to articulate. They settled into their life together in the house on the east side of town that had been empty for a year, and that they spent June and July making habitable, which was another exercise in practical partnership that she enjoyed enormously. Stephen could fix anything structural. She could organize anything spatial. Together, they produced a home that worked, which felt like a good metaphor for most things. She discovered in the first months of their marriage things about him that the careful, measured courtship had not revealed, that he talked in his sleep sometimes, not words exactly, just the sounds of half-conversation, that he had a dry wit that came out unexpectedly in quiet moments, that he read, voraciously and eclectically, and had accumulated a collection of books that she found both surprising and deeply endearing, that he was, when he believed no one was watching, gentle with small things in ways that made her feel she was being given a continuous gift. He discovered things about her, too, that she was in fact more stubborn than she had let on during courtship, not in small things, but in matters of principle, where she was immovable in ways that were sometimes challenging and always admirable, that she had a temper that she rarely deployed but that, when it appeared, was precise and devastating, and not something you wanted directed at you, that she hummed when she cooked, unconsciously, the same 3 or 4 songs in rotation, and that the absence of the humming was the first sign that something was troubling her. In September she told him she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning in the kitchen over coffee, watching his face with the careful attention she gave everything that mattered. She saw the exact sequence of things pass through him: surprise, and then a flooding warmth, and then something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the same reflex of a man who has learned that good things can be taken. And then she watched him deliberately, consciously, set that last thing aside and look at her with pure joy. He came around the table and pulled her up from her chair and held her, and she felt him exhale against her hair, that slow release of tension she had first heard in Mrs. Harper's parlor, the weight going down, and he said into her hair, very quietly, "I am so happy, Margaret." "I know," she said. "I can feel it." The pregnancy proceeded through the fall and winter of 1879 and into the early spring of 1880, and Stephen was, predictably, attentive to a degree that occasionally required gentle management. He worried. He didn't say so, but he worried in the specific, practical way of a man who has learned that bad things are real. He stocked firewood weeks earlier than necessary. He enlisted Rosa Prout's advice on every matter of domestic nutrition. He had 2 conversations with Dr. Hadley that she was pretty certain he hoped she didn't know about. She knew about them. She said nothing, because the worry was love, and the love she would take in any form it came. Her students, when her condition became apparent in December, responded with the cheerful matter-of-factness of children, and Thomas Alvarado informed her gravely that his mother was good with babies and would help if needed, and she thanked him with equal gravity. The baby arrived in April of 1880, a boy, born on a morning with the mountains visible and the desert full of spring bloom, delivered by Dr. Hadley and attended by Rosa Prout, who had become, over the intervening months, something close to a dear friend. Stephen was outside the room in the way of fathers of the era, allowed to pace and worry but not to be present. And when Dr. Hadley opened the door and told him he had a healthy son, she heard his exhale from the other side of the door, and she smiled at Rosa, and Rosa smiled back with the knowing warmth of a woman who has watched something she hoped for arrive. They named him James Thomas Keene. James for Stephen's brother, carried with love and loss all these years. Thomas well, they both agreed they owed the Alvarado family something for the convergence of circumstances that had, in its roundabout way, brought them together properly. Thomas Alvarado, upon learning his name had been partially bestowed, could not decide whether to be proud or embarrassed, and settled for both simultaneously. The day Margaret came home from Dr. Hadley's house, she had stayed there for her recovery, which was the custom. Stephen was waiting at the door of their house with an expression that she had no single word for. He took the baby from her arms with the terrifying carefulness of a large man handling something very small, and stood in their doorway in the spring light and looked down at James Thomas Keene, and she watched him. She was always watching him, and she saw the last sealed room in him open. She saw it because she knew all the rooms. "Hello," Stephen said to the baby very quietly. "I'm your father. I'm going to do a good job of that." She took his arm and they went inside together, the three of them, into the home they had made on the east side of town, and the door closed behind them. The months that followed were full in the way that life with a new baby is full, not always easy, rarely quiet, and shot through with moments of such specific joy that they outweighed everything else. Stephen was a father who showed up completely. He fed James Thomas his bottle in the night when Margaret was exhausted. He walked the baby in the early mornings while she slept, down the quiet, dusty creek streets in the blue light before sunrise, and she would sometimes wake to the sound of him talking softly as he walked, telling the baby about the town, about the mountains, about whatever he was thinking. A running, quiet commentary on the world that was the fullest expression of a man who had been largely silent for years, discovering that he had, in fact, a great deal to say. She returned to teaching in September, with James Thomas spending his days at Rosa Pruitt's until he was old enough for school, an arrangement that delighted Rosa and produced in her son Mateo a devoted guardianship over the younger boy that persisted well into their shared schoolroom years. The territorial superintendent followed through on her curriculum proposal and sent her an expanded budget and a second teacher, a young woman named Ann Solis who had trained in Albuquerque and was, Margaret determined within the first week, exactly as sharp and principled as advertised. Ann had opinions about the treatment of Mexican and Apache children in territorial schools that aligned precisely with Margaret's own, and they worked together with the productive intensity of two people who agree on what matters and disagree, usefully, on how to get there. Stephen was made sheriff in the spring of 1881, when the current sheriff retired to his daughter's ranch in Colorado. He accepted the appointment with the same even composure he applied to everything, but she saw the particular set of his shoulders when he pinned on the new badge, and she said that evening, "It suits you." And he said, "I wasn't sure I wanted it," and she said, "I know. That's exactly why you should have it." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had first seen in Mrs. Harper's parlor, the open one, and said, "How do you always know?" And she said, "I pay attention to you," which was the simplest and most complete answer she had. Life in Dusty Creek was not without its difficult passages. The territory was changing rapidly in the early 1880s, the railroad coming closer, the cattle ranges consolidating, the Apache tensions flaring periodically to the south in ways that sent ripples of fear through settlement communities. Stephen navigated it all with the steady, careful competence of a man who understood that his job was not to be dramatic but to be reliable, and who had always understood the difference between justice and the law, and who refused, sometimes at professional cost, to treat them as synonyms when they weren't. There was a month in the winter of 1882 when a series of cattle thefts brought pressure from the large ranch owners on the east to arrest a group of Apache men who had camped near the water source on the edge of town. Pressure that was less about evidence and more about convenience, and the particular ugliness that the frontier could produce when powerful men were frustrated. Stephen refused, and the refusal was not comfortable, and there were weeks of tension and loud men saying loud things in the sheriff's office and at the council meetings that Margaret attended and noted with precise attention. He was unwavering, and eventually the actual thief was found, a ranch hand from Colorado who had used the presence of the Apache camp as a convenient misdirection, and the pressure collapsed. The incident produced in the town a quiet, renewed respect for Stephen Keene, and in Stephen a private satisfaction that he expressed to Margaret one evening as they sat on their porch after James Thomas was asleep, the desert night around them, the stars their usual extravagance. "You did the right thing," she said. "I know," he said. "It still costs something each time you have to hold the line against the current." "Yes," she said. "That's what integrity feels like from the inside. It rarely feels like victory until afterward." He reached over and took her hand. "You've thought about this more than I have." "I had to," she said. "I came up against versions of it before I met you. The school board in Santa Fe, the Callaway brothers, the territorial reclassification." She looked at him. "You learn if you're paying attention that the current always eventually shifts. The thing that doesn't shift is who you were while you were holding." He was quiet for a while and then he said, "I think about who I was before you found me in that saloon." "You were sitting with a whiskey you didn't want," she said. "I was," he said. "That's a very efficient summary of where I was." "You were also someone who helped search for a boy in the dark, and who wore his badge like a man who takes responsibility seriously, and who had loved someone and grieved for her honestly," she said. "You were already yourself. You were just alone with it." He lifted her hand and held it against his face for a moment, a gesture that still stopped her breath slightly 3 years in because of the quality of tenderness in it. "I was too proud to say I was lonely," he said. "That's what it was. Not that I didn't know it. I knew it. I just couldn't say it." "I know," she said. "I saw it." "The first night in the saloon," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you came over anyway," he said. "I have never been very good at walking past a thing I can clearly see," she said. He smiled, the full, unhurried one, her favorite thing in the territory, and pulled her hand to his lips, and kissed it and said, "Thank God for that." She leaned her head on his shoulder and they sat in the warm desert dark while their son slept inside, and the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and the sage sent up its clean, particular perfume, and Dusty Creek settled into its nighttime quiet all around them. The year 1883 arrived with the news that the railroad would be coming through the southern part of the territory in the next 2 years, which meant Dusty Creek would not be quite so isolated, quite so dependent on the stage and the long overland routes for its connection to the wider world. The town had opinions about this. The older residents were wary change in the territory often brought more of both the good and the hard, and the balance was not always comfortable. The younger ones and the merchants were enthusiastic. Stephen thought carefully about what it meant for law enforcement in a town that was about to become more accessible to both commerce and the other things commerce attracted. Margaret was, mostly, thinking about the school. More people meant more children. More children meant more classrooms, more teachers, more curriculum. She had already been laying groundwork for 2 years. By the time the first railhead came within 50 miles of Dusty Creek, she had a formal proposal on the desk of the territorial superintendent for a 2-room school with proper provision for Spanish-speaking students, a library funded by community subscription and a small territorial grant, and a teacher training program that would allow talented local people, particularly women, to become certified without traveling to Albuquerque. The superintendent approved it in the fall of 1883, and she sat at her kitchen table with the letter, and was very still for a moment in the way of someone who has worked very hard for something, and is feeling the reality of its arrival. She called Stephen from the other room, where he was reading, and James Thomas was using his leg as a road for a small carved horse that the Alvarez family had given him for Christmas. She showed him the letter. He read it twice, as he always did with things that mattered. Then he set it down and looked at her, and his face was the warm, open face she had learned in all its variations, and he said, "This is important work, Margaret." "I know," she said quietly. "Not just for this town," he said. "For the girls who grow up here and think they can't teach because no one will train them. For the kids who speak Spanish at home and get told they have to choose. This matters." She looked at him, this man who had sat alone in a saloon with an untouched glass, this man who had been too proud to say he was lonely, who had learned, slowly and honestly and with her, how to say all the things he meant, and she said, "We both do important work." "Not equally," he said, and when she looked surprised, he shook his head. "What you do will last longer. Buildings come and go, law comes and goes, sheriffs come and go. But what you put in children's minds, that doesn't come out again." He reached across the table and tapped the letter. "This is something." She reached across and put her hand on his. "You are something," she said. "You know that. You've known it for a while now." He turned his hand and held hers, and James Thomas, down on the floor, said with the authority of a 3-year-old who feels he is being excluded from whatever is happening above him, "Mama, Papa." And they both looked down at him, and he held up the carved horse and said, "Horse is hungry." "Then we'd better feed the horse," Margaret said, and Stephen laughed, and the kitchen was full of warmth and noise and the specific happy chaos of a life fully inhabited, and she thought, yes, this is it. This is the whole thing. The spring of 1884 brought with it the news that Margaret was expecting again, and this time she told Stephen on the porch. On a morning in March, when the desert was doing its brief, beautiful green turn, and the air smelled of rain that had come in the night. She said it simply, as she said most things, and his face did the same sequence it had done the first time: surprise, warmth, the briefest flicker of old fear, and then its deliberate release, but faster this time. He had learned the practice of releasing it. He was getting better at it. He stood up and went a stand at the porch railing and looked out at the morning. "James Thomas is going to be beside himself," he said. "He's been asking for a brother or a sister since Christmas." "He has," she agreed, with impressive persistence. "He gets that from you," Stephen said. "He gets it from both of us, and you know it," she said. He turned back and looked at her with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He was 35 now, and the weathering that the territory put on everyone had deepened somewhat, but she had always thought he was more handsome now than when she'd first seen him, because now she could see what the weathering was built on, the solid and considered and real thing underneath. "I do know it," he said. He came back and sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with the ease of long habit and deep comfort. "What name?" he asked. "If it's a boy, you choose," she said. "If it's a girl, I choose." "That's fair," he said. "Though knowing this family, he'll be a boy who requests a different name by the time he's old enough to have opinions." "Then we'll have plenty of time to course correct," she said. The baby came in October of 1884, on a cool autumn evening when the first frost had just touched the valley, and the stars were sharp as wire in the black sky. It was a girl, their daughter, arriving with a voice that suggested she intended to be heard, which Margaret thought was exactly right. She had known the name since spring. She named her Clara Margaret Keene, and she told Stephen while he was holding her, very carefully in the lamplight of Dr. Hadley's house, and she watched his face when she said the first name, and she saw him understand not as pain, but as something healed, something properly held, something finally given its right place in the sequence of things. He looked up from the baby and his eyes were wet, and he was not trying to hide it, which was still, after 5 years, something that moved her deeply. "Clara Margaret," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's right," he said. "That's exactly right." He bent his head over the baby and said something very quietly, too quietly for her to hear, and she did not try to. It was between him and the child and the memory of someone who had deserved to be honored, and she was content to let it be private. James Thomas, informed of his sister's arrival the next morning, assessed the situation with the seriousness of a 4-year-old who had been promised an opinion, and declared that he would teach her everything he knew about horses. Margaret told him that was an excellent plan. Stephen told him it might be a few months before the instruction could begin in earnest. James Thomas said he could wait. Dusty Creek continued to grow and change through the mid-1880s as the railroad's approach became real, and the territory moved steadily, imperfectly, toward statehood, a process that was political and contentious and would not be completed for years yet. But that was reordering everything about life in New Mexico. The school expanded as Margaret had proposed, with a second classroom built in the spring of 1885, and Ann Solis promoted to head of the new Spanish-language instruction program, and 3 local women trained and certified through the program Margaret had fought for. She taught for 4 more years herself before stepping back from the full-time classroom. Not entirely, never entirely, because teaching was a thing she could not do, but taking on instead the role of school superintendent for the district, a position that had been created partly at the territorial superintendent's instigation and partly at Mayor Patterson's, both of whom had reached the conclusion that Margaret Garrison Keene, in a position of broader influence, was a better use of everyone's time than Margaret Garrison Keene in a single classroom. It was meaningful work, and harder in different ways, and she was good at it. Stephen remained sheriff through 1887, when he stood down voluntarily and recommended his deputy, a careful, principled young man named Ramirez, who had come up through the department over 4 years, for the appointment. He took on the role of U.S. Marshal's liaison for the district, which gave him jurisdiction over a broader territory and suited, he said, his preference for the kind of law that was about structures rather than the daily management of whatever trouble found its way into town. He was home more. He read more. He took James Thomas, who was now 7 and horse-obsessed and opinionated, and entirely his mother's son in the ways that would matter, out riding on Saturday mornings, in a ritual that the boy treasured with visible intensity. He read to Clara Margaret in the evenings, patient and unhurried, holding her on his knee with the book propped on the table, while she pointed at pictures and made pronouncements about them with the authority of a 2-year-old who has always been listened to. One evening, in the fall of 1887, Margaret was sitting at her desk going over district reports when Stephen came and leaned in the doorway of her study. They had made her the study, a small room at the back of the house that she had claimed early, and that was full of her books and her papers, and the clay pot she had bought from an Apache woman at the market in the summer, which was the most beautiful thing in the room. And he said, "James Thomas told me today that he wants to be a teacher when he grows up." She set down her pen. "What did you tell him?" "I told him his mother was the best one I knew and he could probably learn from her." Stephen paused. "Then he told me he wants to teach horses, specifically how to communicate with them." She laughed. "I will put that in my report to the superintendent as a new curricular innovation." "He's serious," Stephen said, coming fully into the room and sitting in the chair across from her desk, the big leather chair that he had brought in when it became clear that she worked late most evenings and that he was going to sit with her while she did. He spent an hour this afternoon explaining to Clara that horses understand if you're nervous. Clara's opinion. She told him horses are not as interesting as rabbits, Stephen said. "She's been thinking about rabbits for weeks," Margaret said. "I think Thomas Alvarado may have told her the rabbit story." "Thomas Alvarado is too old to be telling my daughter story about rabbits," Stephen said, without any heat, because Thomas Alvarado at 11 was still their people, still the unofficial mascot, still showing up with the frequency and loyalty of a person who has decided your family is his family and no one has seen fit to argue. "He's a good boy," Margaret said. "He's a good kid," Stephen agreed. He looked at her with a familiar look, comfortable and warm as the lamplight. "You brought this whole family into being, you know." "We did," she said. "You," he said. You came over and talked to a man sitting alone with a drink he hadn't touched. You decided that was worth your time. She looked at him steadily. It was the best decision I've ever made. I was a mess, he said. You were not a mess, she said. You were a man in pain who had decided pain was all there was. That's different from being a mess. That's a very generous reading. It's an accurate one, she said. I'm always accurate. I know, he said. That is one of the things about you that is occasionally inconvenient, and always the reason I trust you completely. She stood up from her desk and came around it, and he stood as she approached, the old instinct of a man raised to rise when a woman stood, but also something more than that, the reflex of someone who wants to be on the same level with this particular person always. She put her hands on his face and looked at him. Stephen Keene, she said, you are the best person I know. He put his hands over hers. Margaret Keene, he said, you saved my life. That's a bit dramatic, she said. I mean it practically, he said. Not metaphorically. Before that saloon, I was here, but I wasn't living. I was just making it through days. You made it a life. He held her hands against his face. I don't think I ever said that directly enough. You said it many times, she said, in different ways. I want to say it in the direct way, he said. You've told me often enough that the direct way matters, she smiled. It does, she said, and I hear it. Good, he said. And he kissed her, there in her study among the books and the papers and the beautiful clay pot, with the lamp burning low and their children asleep in the rooms down the hall. And it was still the same as the first one on the ridge, careful and then not careful at all, honest all the way through. The years rolled on in the way that good years do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary sorrows that life in the territory continued to offer, but with the specific richness of lives lived fully and in genuine company. The railroad came through Dusty Creek in 1889, and the town changed as everyone had known it would, growing faster, noisier, more various, and Margaret's school system absorbed the growth the way she had designed it to, with structures that could expand, with teachers who were good and properly trained, with a library that by 1890 had enough books that James Thomas, now 10, could spend entire Saturdays there, and emerge a little wild-eyed and full of questions. He remained his mother's son in the essential ways, precise and curious and direct to the point of occasional social friction. He was also, unmistakably, his father's steady in a crisis, good with his hands, better at showing kindness than announcing it. He did not, in the end, teach horses professionally, though he never stopped maintaining that horses had complex emotional lives that were underappreciated, and he grew up to read law, which his father thought was an excellent outcome, and his mother thought was inevitable given his temperament. Clara Margaret Keene grew up into a personality that surprised everyone in the specific ways that younger children often do. She was, it turned out, not the echo of either parent but something of her own, full of her grandfather's art, which she had inherited through Margaret from a grandmother she'd never known, and a fierce social conscience that emerged early and intensified. She drew with the same precision her mother brought to words. She also, at the age of 8, organized a letter-writing campaign by her classmates to the territorial governor about the treatment of Apache children in the school system, a campaign that was better organized than most adults could have managed and that the territorial governor's office did not quite know what to do with. Stephen, reading the carbon copy of the letter, said to Margaret, "This is entirely your fault." "Our fault," she said. "You raised her." "I raised James Thomas," he said. Clara came out like this already assembled. "She comes from people who pay attention," Margaret said. "We should have expected this." He folded the letter and put it on his desk and smiled. "I'm not objecting," he said. "I'm celebrating." In the spring of 1892, Margaret turned 40, and Stephen organized a supper in her honor that involved Rosa Prute's full considerable talents, the Alvarez family, whose Thomas was now 24 and studying to be a doctor in Albuquerque. A long letter read aloud from Aunt Solis, who had moved to Santa Fe to run the Territorial Women's Teacher Training Program 3 years earlier, and the population of Dusty Creek in sufficient numbers to fill the church hall to capacity. Stephen gave a toast. He was not, by instinct, a man for public speaking, and the room knew this and was warm with affection for the visible effort he was making. He said that he had been asked to say a few words about Margaret Garrison Keene, and that he was not sure a few words would cover it, but he would try. He said that she had come to Dusty Creek on a stage in the autumn of 1878 and had proceeded, with characteristic efficiency, to improve nearly everything she touched. He said that she had built a school system that gave children in the territory opportunities that had not existed before she arrived. He said that she had made a home for their family that was full of books and argument and good food, and the comfortable noise of people who were genuinely glad to be in each other's company. Then he paused and looked at her across the room, and the room went quiet in the way it does when everyone can feel that something real is about to be said. She walked over to a man sitting alone in a bar, he said, and she talked to him, and she saw him more clearly than he'd seen himself in years, and she kept seeing him, even when he made it difficult. She was too knowing to pretend she didn't see it, and I was too proud or too broken to admit I needed to be seen. He lifted his glass. I am a better man for every year of her company. I intend to be a better man for every year that follows. Margaret, you are my favorite thing in this territory, and that is a very high bar given that I love this territory considerably. She laughed, and the room laughed, and she rose and went to him and kissed him in front of the entire population of Dusty Creek, which produced an ovation, and Thomas Alvarado's voice above the crowd saying something in joyful Spanish that made his mother cover her mouth. Afterward, walking home in the April night, their children between them, James Thomas with his father's long stride and Clara with her mother's brisk one, she took Stephen's hand and said, "You were not too broken. You were just waiting." "For you," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "Or for yourself. I may have simply been the occasion." He looked at her sideways with that look she loved. "You are always arguing with my compliments." "I am always correcting your imprecision," she said. "There's a difference." He laughed. A full laugh, unhurried and warm. The laugh she had worked out over 14 years was his real one, rare and therefore wonderful. James Thomas looked up at the sound of it the way he always had since he was old enough to notice things, with a particular satisfaction, as though it confirmed something important about the structure of the world. They walked on through the spring night, the four of them, through the town that had grown around them and that bore, in dozens of ways you would only see if you were paying careful attention, the marks of their years in it. The school with its new wing. The library with Margaret's name above the reading room door. The sheriff's office where Stephen had proposed and where Deputy Ramirez now sat at a different desk. The saloon where it had all begun, where Hector Prout still kept half a pharmacy behind his counter and a photograph on the wall. It had been taken in 1881. A traveling photographer, Margaret and Stephen outside the school, that he had never taken down. Their house waited for them on the east side of town, lights in the windows, the porch where they sat on summer evenings and watched the stars come out. Inside, the books and the papers, the leather chair, the clay pot from the Apache market, the carved horse on the mantel that James Thomas had kept since he was 4 because he said it was good luck, and Clara had already indicated she would inherit it. Margaret stood on the porch for a moment before going in and looked back at the town, and then up at the mountains, dark against the stars, the same mountains she had seen from the stage on the day she arrived, and thought about the woman she had been then, capable and clear-eyed and braced for whatever came, but quietly, privately lonely in the way of someone who has not yet found the person who can properly see them in return. Stephen stood beside her. He put his arm around her shoulders. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She leaned into him. "That I made a very good decision," she said. "The camphor," he said. She laughed, surprised. "You remember that?" "I remember everything about that first night," he said. I was sitting there telling myself I was fine, and then this woman walked in and looked at me like I was the most interesting thing in the room, and then had the audacity to tell me I hadn't touched my drink and ask me why. "You hadn't," she said. "I know I hadn't," he said. "That was the thing. I didn't need you to point it out. I needed someone to notice enough to ask." She looked up at him. He was looking at the mountains too, his face in profile against the night sky, the face she knew better than anything in the world. "I noticed," she said. "You noticed," he agreed. He looked down at her. "I will spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." She reached up and touched his face, and he turned into her palm, and they stood on their porch in the spring dark while inside their children argued cheerfully about something involving the carved horse, and Dusty Creek was quiet around them, and the mountains stood their ancient watch to the north, and the stars came out one by one above the high desert of New Mexico territory, filling up the enormous sky. "Come inside," she said finally. "In a minute," he said. She went in and she left the door open for him, and in a moment she heard his step on the porch boards, and then the soft sound of the door, and he was home.